Excellent. Okay, first of all, special education law. Where does it come from? You've got a federal statute, and each state has state level laws, and then you have fair hearings. Now, the federal law trumps everything. States can come in and they can be more restrictive, but they can't be less restrictive when it comes to special education law. For example, the federal law says that you have 60 days to assess a student from the date of the assessment plan is received by the district. Now, before we go on, let's talk about that. The date the parent signs the assessment plan is not when the 60-day timeline starts. It's the date that the district receives the assessment plan. If your district receives an assessment plan and they do not mark on it the date that it was received, then the date the parent signed it is considered the start date. So it is very important, all the secretaries at all your school sites know that when they get that assessment plan, they indicate the date it was received, because that starts your 60-day timeline. That being said, if that secretary then puts it in a routing folder to the special education department at the district office, and that takes 4 or 5 days, and then the secretary at the special education office puts it in a routing folder to you, your timeline is running. So hopefully your SAI teachers, if they send out the assessment plan, they have a process for getting it back in a timely manner or being informed right away. All right. We got sidetracked already. So the federal law gives you 60 days to assess a child. Now in California, our law is more restrictive. We have 60 days to assess and hold an IEP meeting. That's perfectly legal, and we are bound by that. Now, let's talk due process or fair hearings. Fair hearings what will happen is a parent will take a district to court, and the judge will hear the case and make a ruling. Every district out there will then change their entire special education policy based on that ruling. Due process and fair hearings do not establish precedents like normal court cases do. In special education, every court case is considered to be unique and individualized. So try to train your districts not to overreact to a fair hearing, because the exact same scenario presented with another student is considered to be totally unique to that student. But it does give us an idea of, as I say here, the zeitgeist or the current cultural temperature of the special education climate out there. That's what fair hearings do. And you can subscribe to a listserv that will send you the summaries of all the special education cases held every month. These are summaries that go through exactly what the parent was charging the district with, the parent's evidence, the district's evidence, all the discussions, and then the ruling. And the rulings are important, and they're interesting because the judge backs up every one of his or her rulings with case law, and they'll reference cases. And that's where this presentation came from. As I started reading these cases, I realized there's only like 15 cases that keep coming up over and over again. 15 cases that districts keep ignoring or handling wrong. And so That's where these came from. Now, when I sent out for this presentation, because I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice, we're just sort of having a conversation. When I send out the feedback form, I'm also going to send you a PDF of chapter 20 in my book, which is the frequently cited legal decision, regulations, and law. This way you know exactly where I got my information. Everything is cited, and if something goes wrong, you know where that information came from, what case it came from. In fact, let me give you an example here. Let's talk about the Rowley Act. Well, we've already talked about this in prior presentations, but it's basically the one that told the school districts, hey, you don't have to provide the Royal Royce, the Jaguar of services. You can provide the Ford Pinto, right? You provide the basic floor of opportunity, sufficient to confer some educational benefit that is reasonable. Now, all fair hearings and all law and special education, if you look here in the middle of the page, you see sufficient to confer some educational benefit, reasonable at that time, not in hindsight. That's very important to remember. An IEP team must make the best decision with the information they have at the time. Later on, when the parents take the district to court, the parents can't say that, 6 months later it became obvious that this was the wrong choice. They have to stick with the information that was available the day of the IEP meeting, the day the decision was made. And so hindsight is not a factor. You act with the best information you have at the time. And you're always acting in the best interest of the child, not the teacher, not the district, but the child. As long as you do that, you're okay. If that information changes, it is necessary for us then to change our services or to address that change in an IEP meeting. Let's say you hold an IEP meeting and the kid does not qualify for OHI, but they are receiving SLD services. 2 weeks later, the parent comes back with a doctor's diagnosis of ADHD. Now, you tested the kid for OHI, so presumably you gave them some assessments for ADHD, like the Conners Continuous Performance Test. You gave them the BASC, you gave them the Conners Parent and Teacher Surveys. A diagnosis of ADHD doesn't change the eligibility, but the IEP team should hold another meeting, incorporate that information, and reconsider the possibility of eligibility. Just because your psychoed didn't qualify the kid under OHI doesn't mean that the IEP team cannot just go ahead and qualify the kid under OHI. Qualification is an IEP team decision. It is not our decision as school psychologists. We do determine eligibility, but we don't determine qualification. And so the team could decide to act on it. The important part is that you met to discuss this new information. Should you ignore it and not meet, then you open yourself up to liability and to the district. So the Rowley Act goes on to specify that you cannot you cannot rule in or rule out eligibility based on one test. Benefit may be gained by the student if some of the goals are met. They don't even have to meet all the goals. And grade level performance obviously is not necessary. We all know those students in SDC who will never be at grade level. According to the Rowley Act, they don't have to be at grade level to be making progress. We just have to make sure they're making progress on some of their goals. it established, it eliminated an undue burden on school districts to maximize every child's potential. And we think, wouldn't we want to do that? Yes, as human beings, yes, as educators, but there's limits. There's limits as to how much we can spend to make that happen. And so the Rowley Act gave the school districts a break. Now, the Rowley Act does include parent participation. And we're going to talk much more about what parent participation is later on. But you must be able to document it. You must be able to place equal emphasis on the student and the parent, on the services and the parent, on the advice of the speech and language pathologist and the parent. Basically, the parent gets equal say in everything. Keep them informed. Now, what's neat about the Rowley Act was in March 22nd, 2017, the U.S. Supreme Court said, wait a minute. The Rowley Act was appropriate for that particular case. That kid's last name was Rowley. They said that IEPs must actually provide meaningful education benefit. And it has to pertain to that student's current situation. So, in other words, they said it has to be individualized. It can't be just progress on goals. If that particular student is capable of making more progress than just progress on goals, and all you're doing is measuring progress on goals, you've not provided FAPE. In fact, you've denied FAPE. The Supreme Court did not define meaningful, and I think, well, as with most things law, that's intentional. That leaves it up to the courts and the due process proceedings to define what meaningful looks like for that particular student. In the Rowley case, the child was an SDC child, out of general education all day long, no chance of grade level performance, no reasonable chance. The 2017 case, the child was autistic, pretty high functioning. The district had put the child in an autistic program that was an SDC class, not expecting classroom performance, grade level performance. And so what the parents did is they pulled the child out, put him in a private school for autistic children at a cost of $70,000 a year. But you know what? That kid thrived. He ended up performing at grade level, something he would have never done in the district with the district's offer of FAPE. So the district said, hey, wait a minute. He was making progress on his goals, so we met Rowley. We met the basic floor of opportunity. And the Supreme Court, actually it was upheld at some of the lower courts, but when it got to the Supreme Court said, no, you didn't. This child obviously had far more potential for grade level work than you had, than you were providing, or than you had acknowledged in the IEP, so therefore you denied the child FAPE. And of course, they were reimbursed the tuition for the school. So, districts must develop an IEP that is reasonably likely to have a meaningful education benefit in light of the student's unique circumstances at that time. Basically, guys, what this means for us is that the more individualized the IEP is, the better. And this will be a constant challenge for you, for the SAI teachers, for your speech and language pathologists, for the OTs, because we're all human beings and we all like to work with the tools we have. If we don't have to learn anything new, let's not. If we don't have to change things up, let's not. But that's not going to fly anymore. Okay, look up that Supreme Court decision if you get a chance. It's a real interesting read. Let's talk about burden of proof. Now, this is why districts do not take parents to court that often or to fair hearing, because the petitioning party must prove. They must, actually, the word that they have is persuade. They don't really have a burden of proof as much as they have a burden of persuasion. So if the parent files against the district, then the parent has to provide that persuasion. And I just realized I am blocking some of that. Let me move over here. In fact, I'll tell you what, let's take this down a little bit. Don't too much. How's that? Okay. I'm assuming by your silence that it's fine. Okay. So the parents must persuade the court that the district did something wrong. Therefore, the school district, your obligation then is to defend your choices based on what you knew at the time. Their obligation is to prove negligence, keeping in mind that in most cases, in order to prove negligence, they would also have to prove a layer of intent. And so that's where we talked about before with the IEEs, the independent education evaluations. The only way that really is going to come back as very, very negative for you is if you intentionally did something you shouldn't have done. You lied in a report. You knew this would help the kid, but you wanted to leave it out because you didn't like this kid or you didn't like the parent. That kind of intentional stuff. So keep your personal feelings out of it, out of special ed, because that's where the trouble will start. Okay. The burden of proof. All right. Again, it has to be based on the information that was known at the time, not on hindsight. All right. Years ago, when I first got into special education, a small procedural error would automatically trigger a denial of FAPE ruling. Okay. You missed an annual due date by a day. The judge will say that's a denial of FAPE, parent wins. Small things like that. Maybe the IEP wasn't filled out completely. Maybe there was a misstatement. Maybe the teacher had, the note taker had noted the wrong teacher saying something. Nowadays, that's been revised, especially after the revisions of 2004. So procedural flaws and failures these days do not automatically find a denial of FAPE. They have to be overt. They have to be very big. In fact, a procedural violation would only constitute a denial of FAPE if it actually did impact the child. All right. If it significantly restricted the parent's involvement, the teacher's ability to teach the child or to know about the child, if it caused the special education teacher not to be able to provide reasonable and expected services. It's where the procedural violations used to really come into play was manifestation determinations. Any procedural problem on an IEP, and if you look at an IEP, you will find mistakes. In fact, I highly encourage you to review an IEP or two every month from at least one of your SAI teachers and provide some constructive feedback once you're competent enough to do that. As director, I do that with all of my SAI teachers. I aim for 2 IEPs a month from every teacher. I don't always make it, but they do get feedback and on procedural issues mostly. So, and that just makes us all better. I learned something by reviewing the IEPs. They learn something, and a lot of times what I find and think is wrong might not be wrong. In fact, a lot of times there was a discussion that went on that supported that decision, that what appears to be a violation of procedural of a procedural element, but it didn't get noted in the notes section. So that in and of itself is a problem. All right, let's talk about statutes of limitations. Used to be, before 2004, the parent of a graduating senior who had an IEP could say, wait a minute, my son is not able to pass the community college entrance exam, therefore I need 12 years of compensatory education. And in 2004, that was changed to basically 2 years. 2 years, that's as far back as they can go to file a complaint or to claim compensatory. Unless, and there's always an exception to the law. But let's talk about when this 2-year timeline begins. So as you see in the bottom here, the 2-year timeline starts when the parent is aware of the fact that would support a legal claim, but it does not start when they know they have a legal claim. So you've got a 6th grader. The team has decided to place this child in SDC because of conduct problems. The child was doing fine grade-wise. They were getting A's, B's, and C's, but the behavior was a concern, so they moved into an SDC ED classroom. Although the child had an OHI and an SLD qualification, his behavior was just so out of control. And the parents don't like this because the child was making progress in the general education curriculum, and now they're not exposed to the general education curriculum in an SDC class. They don't know that they have a legal case here, but they know this isn't right. So that starts their 2-year timeline to file a complaint. So they've got 2 years. Now, let's say come 10th grade, they become aware that this is actually a legal issue that could have been addressed back in 6th grade. In 10th grade, they can go back as far as 8th grade, seeking compensatory and seeking damages and all of that. So it kind of saved the districts a little bit. It puts some of the responsibility, as it has always been, on the parents. But remember, special education law is all about protecting the parents' rights. The parents just have to be aware of those rights. And how do we make parents aware of those rights? Procedural safeguards. Right. Now, I'm going to remind you of this again before the presentation is over. But please, always read those procedural safeguards at least once a year. You give them out time after time. You see them given out at every IEP meeting. But by and large, none of us read them. I was real surprised years ago when I actually sat down and read those. And all this great information and all of this legal information that parents are getting, if the parents would actually read it, you would see a lot more involved parents standing up for their rights. So make sure you read it and reread it. Let's talk about child fine for a minute. Child fine is the part of the law that requires the districts and the state to identify, to locate, and to assess all students in their boundaries with a disability, and find those students who need special education services and at least offer special education services to their students. It is not the responsibility of the parent to bring it to our attention or to tell us that their child has a diagnosis. It is not the responsibility of a private school who the parent is paying for the student to attend to inform us. It's the district's responsibility to assess all of those children, to if there's any reason a child at a private school might have a disability, the district has to reach out and say, you know what, we'd like to investigate this a little bit further. The onus to find the child with any disability anywhere in the district is completely up to the district. It cannot waive its child find responsibility, and this will get a district in trouble faster than anything. So let's say we just talked about that 2-year limitation. This is the time it doesn't apply. Let's say Johnny. No, let's do another name. Let's do Valerie. Okay, so Valerie has been attending private Catholic school since kindergarten, and she is now in the 10th grade. And Valerie is really struggling with advanced math, and reading comprehension is just not there. The schools have been passing her along. She's been getting a lot of individualized attention and tutoring, but it's all been through the private school. And the parents come to the district, and they say, Valerie's not doing well in school. We don't know why. We would like you to assess her. Okay, first of all, a parent request for an assessment is, especially if it's a private school kid, just take that as golden. Take it as an order. You're going to assess that child. You are not going to filter that child through an SST process. They're at a private school. Most of the time, the courts are going to assume a higher level of tutoring and one-on-one attention with a private school, right or wrong. So a parent of a child, the child lives in your district, the child attends a private school, the parent says, hey, I want my child assessed. You say yes and set up a date to do the assessment. Now, you do an assessment and you find out, well, this child has dyscalculia, dyslexia, mild, moderate ADHD. Valerie would meet the eligibility under SLD, OHI, and you might even see a few other areas of concern. So now the parents go to the district. Well, they happen to know a special education lawyer, so they go to their special education lawyer and they say, look at this report. And the lawyer goes to the district and say, district, the kid's in 10th grade, you failed on your child fine, you owe compensatory education back to kindergarten. And in this case, the 2-year limit is very likely going to be overruled, and the district will be providing 10 years of compensatory education, even if the parents keep the child at the private school. That's just to demonstrate the power or the responsibility that child find puts on a district. So ideally, your district is mailing out to all of its parents a special education info packet that talks about how to get their child assessed, how to start receiving services. Because if the district is doing that regularly and can prove it, then the attorney is going to have a hard time going all the way back to kindergarten, because the parents would have knowledge of the assessment and maybe even some indicators as to what a struggling student really looks like. And again, that would bring into the possibility that the parent was aware there was a legal malfeasance years ago, but didn't realize they had a legal case until now, so you can only go back 2 years. Anyway, don't count on it. Just realize the district's responsibility for child fine is absolute. There's no way you get out of it. So let's talk about parent. Who is a parent? And the reason this is important is especially with our group home kids, those kids who have been removed from the home, placed in a group home setting. And these group homes are either small, that is, they have 7 or 8 kids, and it's usually a small house, well, a large house, but just a house. Or it's more of an institutional setting where you might have 100 kids. and they're living in cottages or dorm rooms, situations, stuff like that. And the question is going to come up, well, who is the parent? Now, the courts almost never remove parent rights when it comes to education. They will, if a child is placed in a group home, in all likelihood, the group home has absolute authority when it comes to medical, dental, mental health. But the group home has no say when it comes to education. Those rights are maintained by the parent in almost 99 of 100 cases. So a parent then is the biological or the adoptive parents, okay, unless the authority has been taken away. And in a group home setting, it is necessary for the district to find the parents and to get the parents' participation and permission to assess, and participation in an IEP meeting. Permission, they have to sign the IEP meeting or sign the IEP document so that services can begin or continue. The IDA does assume that parents and districts are working together. This is not always the case, but that is the assumption of the law. They also assume that the parents will have a significant role, but that is not to say that the parents can simply say, I want it done my way. We're going to provide this service at this site for this amount of time, says the parent, and boom, that's the way it's going to be. No, the parent's not allowed to do that. In fact, the parent, although the parent must be able to participate to a significant degree in the child's IEP, the parent cannot make the offer of FAPE. Now, I have been in a number of IEPs where I've heard the principal or the school district administrator say, it's time for Emmett to go to an NPS, a non-public school. In that setting, he'll get the constant behavior modification and intervention that he needs so he can get all of his executive functioning skills and he can learn some life skills and get back to the public school setting. Now, parent, I understand you're a little apprehensive about that and you would like to view the NPSs. Well, I have 3 of them right here. Here are their addresses. Call them up, make an appointment, do a tour. Let me know which one you want me to send Emmett to. That's absolutely illegal. That is allowing the parent to make the offer of FAPE. That is putting aside the district's responsibility to offer FAPE. Now, the district can say, the district can arrange a tour, go with the parent on the tour, come back and have a discussion with the parent, and then the district says, we're going to send them to child help. And they did this in consultation with the parent, but they did not simply allow the parent to pick. That's okay, and that's good parent involvement. The district can never waive its responsibility to make that offer of FAPE. Okay. Among the most important procedural safeguards are those that protect the parent's rights to be involved in the development of their child's IEP. So, what does involvement mean? What are we talking about? So the school district is required not just to have the parent at the IEP team meeting, but to have the parent have a meaningful participation in the IEP team meeting. The parent, how do you determine if the parent has made a significant and a meaningful contribution to the IEP? There's actually a ruling for that, and this is it. A parent has meaningfully participated when they are informed of their child's issues, they are attending the IEP meeting. That means they're attending the IEP meeting with knowledge, because you've sent home a draft of the psychoed. You've sent home a draft of the IEP, so they've been informed. They're attending the IEP meeting. They express a disagreement with the IEP, and that request results in a discussion and a revision of the IEP. That is the definition legally that came up at one of the fair hearings, that is often referenced by law as an indication, a clear indication, that the parent did participate. So this parent can never go back and say that in last year's IEP meeting, I really didn't have a say. Because in last year's IEP meeting, the parent came in with knowledge of the issues, participated in the development, argued, got the IEP changed, and then moved on, signed it. No doubt about it. A parent signs an IEP without arguing, without significant contribution. That parent can always come back and say, I really didn't know what was going on. I really didn't understand. I was overwhelmed. There were so many people at the meeting. That really isn't an informed consent. So I'm not saying start an argument with your parent, but if a parent starts to bring up an issue, embrace it, because this is your evidence you're going to need. Embrace it, note it, clearly discuss why the team agrees with it or does not agree with it. So the whole purpose of the IEP then, of the IEP process, is to ensure that the parents' interests are not overran by the district's interests, that the district is not stepping in and unilaterally deciding what the offer of FAPE is going to be. That being said, let's say, for example, let's go back to Emmett. Emmett needs that NPS program. Emmett. Yeah, we were sending Emmett to the NPS, weren't we? Let's go back to Valerie. Valerie was an OHI SLD student. Okay, let's talk about Michael. So Michael's in a general education setting. He's got 49% of his day. He's in an RSP setting. The district really needs to move him into an SDC class. They decide to modify the IEP and send it home to the parent for signature. No go. This is why, to change a placement, to go from RSP to SDC, number one, you should be conducting an assessment as a school psychologist. You should be conducting an assessment that supports that move or doesn't support it. I mean, of course, you're independent. You don't have to go either way. You're just going to go with the facts. Never try to do a change of placement IEP on the phone. Just call the parent, tell them we're moving them to SDC, get their permission, and say we'll send it home for signature. That doesn't work for a change of placement. It might work for a small procedural correction. Maybe the teacher forgot to update the percentage of time out of general ed. Fine. Do that as a phone addendum, but not something like this. Districts get in trouble when they overrun the parent and unilaterally decide on the offer of FAPE, even if that's in the best interest of the child. They cannot do that. They have to have parent participation. All right. You guys know, or you will soon know, that the district's required to provide interpreters. Interpreters, if a parent speaks a different language, how in the world can they have a significant contribution and play a significant role in the child's IEP if they can't read the document and if they can't understand what you're saying because they speak Spanish? Or here in one of our districts around here, Banning has a large population of people that speak Hmong, or they're Hmong, and I don't know what they speak, but anyway, it's a language that we have almost no interpreters for. Hang on, did somebody just join? Let me take a quick look here real quick. There we go. All right, welcome aboard. Okay, let's go back to my screen. Excellent. Okay. So the IDA does require that we take whatever action is necessary to ensure we have an interpreter and to ensure that somebody can translate the IEP document. Including, as it says here, a sign language person for deaf parents. You'll find that deaf and Spanish-speaking parents are the least of your concerns. You're going to have interpreters for those. You're going to have a sign language person in most districts. You're going to have these parents who have this unusual sort of language. It's a one-off. The district must take whatever action is necessary to bring in an interpreter, unless it is just not humanly possible. And that's not the case anymore. It's going to be possible. IEP notices, the assessment plans, the documents, your report must all be written in the parent's language. And if the parent doesn't have a written language, then you need to find some other means of conveying that information. I've never ran across a parent who didn't have a written language, but that is actually something they considered in the law. I want to go back a slide. Okay, yeah. I just want to make sure I gave you the Code of Federal Regulation that talks about interpreters. Okay. I love this one because districts get this wrong all the time. This is our duty to assess. Now, we talked about child find. Child find is different. Child find, we've got to find that child in the system, in our district with a disability. That's our responsibility. When do we have to assess? Our duty to assess is broader than just the areas of qualification. Okay, it is more easily triggered. In fact, the rulings on this have used this as your deciding measure to assess. The correct question to ask is there any reason to suspect this student might have a disability? You do not ask, will this student qualify for special education? That's the wrong question. So, what is a reason to suspect? Basically, any poor grade. Any F ever could qualify for an assessment. Could meet that very low bar for assessment. So, that being said, where does this really apply? It applies to those SST referrals coming to you from the school sites. Guys, used to be, worked for a district, and most districts do this. The SST teams at the school sites, they get the psychologist involved. The psychologist makes a decision to assess or not assess. And basically what the psychologist does is they say, let's not move forward on assessment right now. Let's go back to the SST and let's try this, this, and that. Okay. That's illegal. If you're going to have this discussion with your SST coordinator about qualification, and the SST coordinator has said in the SST meeting, you know what, I'm going to take this to our school psychologist. At that point, you're making a decision about assessment. At that point, number one, you pay attention to this law, which says your responsibility to assess is just if there's any reason to suspect. In my opinion, a child would not be in going through the SST process if there wasn't some reason, if there wasn't a hint of a possible, potential, very slight disability. And so, one, I would recommend assessing. Two, if you tell the SST coordinator, no, I would like you to try these things first, you have actually legally assessed that child and found them not to qualify. So at that point, the parent has a right to an IEE. Also, if you do that and you do not do it in writing to the parent and to the team, you've not provided prior written notice of this decision. And so again, that's a procedural error. But in this case, it's a procedural error that does deny a potential special education student access to special education services. So that's a major flaw. Never deny or approve an SST referral without doing a prior written notice. Now, we should probably do a little caveat one day on what a prior written notice is, because they are extremely misunderstood, and it's mainly due to that title. It's not really a prior written notice. That's the wrong wording, but we'll go over it. We'll definitely do that one day. Okay. All school districts, a school district's duty to assess a student's eligibility for special education related services is also triggered by any request for special education or assessment from the parent. You're in a public school, the parent has written a letter, I would assess. That is what the California Code of Regulations says. Title 5, Section 3021, Paragraph A. I don't know how that's read, but anyway, you can look it up yourself and interpret it for yourself. A parent request, parents know the kids better than anybody. The courts are going to understand that. They're going to understand their child appears to be struggling. They're going to understand that the district is being a little selfish if it doesn't assess. I mean, after all, you've got a full-time school psychologist. She's only doing 150 other cases. What's one more case? No, it's not quite that bad, but here, the district's duty to assess does apply to a parent request. Now, there exists a conflict between our duty to assess and our duty to rule out general education intervention. So if the district suspects a student may have a disability, it must conduct an assessment. However, a student shall be referred for special education only after resources of the regular education program have been considered, utilized, and basically filled. How do you do that? Because your assessment must rule out general education intervention if it's appropriate. Now, it's not always appropriate. There are times when you know the general education interventions are not going to work. And I have told this story 100 times about the SST team who was rushing a blind student through the process because they were told they had to do 3 SSTs before they could do a referral. That's a student you don't even have to worry about general education interventions on, right? You know they're going to qualify. You know a student with Down syndrome will probably require special education. Not all of them, but most of them do. You know a student with autism may indeed require, that's a little difficult, isn't it? Because they may require special education, they may not. They will probably require some 504 for protection. And for accommodations. That's a tricky one. But anyway, there is this conflict. Now, I would never turn down an assessment simply because the regular education interventions have not been tried. What I would do is what's called a concurrent assessment. So you get the parent to sign an assessment plan. You elongate the assessment plan process to, say, 50 days. At the same time, your SST team is providing general, regular education interventions. By the time you reach that 45-day mark, when you're putting the final touches on your psychoed, you can go to your SST teams and say, hey, tell me what regular education interventions you have tried and their outcome. And that will help color the child's eligibility, your eligibility recommendations. So keep in mind, you can do a concurrent assessment, concurrent with the SST process, in order to meet both of these sort of conflict in the law, both of these regulations. Okay. Now, the next session, I do not want to spend a lot of time on timelines. Timelines are explained throughout the law in various sections. Chances are people have already driven home the importance of timeline to you. A couple things I want to point out though. One, if a parent requests records, the district has 5 days to respond to that request. It's a very short fused time frame. So make sure that if the parent gives you that request in writing, by the way, it has to be in writing, and an email does count as being in writing. Okay? Make sure you get that request to whoever needs to fulfill it that same day, because they're on a very tight timeline. When it comes to annuals and triannuals, when it comes to initials, for us, initials and triannuals, the date for the assessment, the date that the assessments must be completed, is the 60 days from the date the district received the assessment plan, or the due date, whichever is earlier. Okay. And this will back us up a little bit of time, every so often, and shorten the amount of time we have to do assessments, because your SAI teacher has sent out several assessment plans that the parent's not returning, or forgot to send out the assessment plan, and oh my gosh, this meeting is scheduled for next week, it's due in 10 days, and I didn't realize it was a try. You've got a week to do the assessment. You've got to the triennial due date, and you've got a week assuming you can get the assessment plan signed that day. There's just no leniency there. And so assessment plan does not always give us 60 days. The triennial date might limit us. Some other short fused timelines are mainly the manifestation of termination, which gives you 10 calendar days, 10 school days to hold a manifestation of termination meeting. 10 school days, that's all. If, let's say you've got a child up for expulsion, and you'll see this a lot. So Nathan has brought a knife to school. He threatened another student. He didn't actually bring it. He found the knife on his way into school. He showed it to a student. He threatened another student with it because that other student slapped him on the back of the head during recess. The school is putting him up for expulsion, and the parents are upset. They've hired a lawyer. The lawyer says, you know what, this behavior is consistent with the impulsivity of an ADHD student. I see here the district has never assessed this child, so we're going to need a complete assessment. Technically, that 10-day timeline applies to you. I have never pushed that issue. I think you could make a case that a good assessment can't be done in 10 days, so therefore the manifestation cannot be held within the 10-day time frame. And of course, you know what excuse the state will take, which is nothing. They will see the manifestation as being late. It will show up as a late manifestation. It does not matter why. Now, in all honesty, I've been able to do those assessments in 10 days, but everything else goes on hold. The principal and the director gets involved with telling the teachers to provide the information right away, with giving the teachers subs so that they can just work on the surveys that you need done, giving the SAI teacher either a sub so she or he can do the Woodcock-Johnson, or bringing in somebody from the outside to do the Woodcock-Johnson right away, so that we can all meet that 10-day timeline with an assessment. It's an amazing thing to see happen, but if the district's desperate enough, they can make it happen. Those are fun. And by the way, I set that scenario up because he found the knife, so he didn't bring it with him. He found it on the way to school. He showed it to another kid, and that's impulsive. He threatened another kid with it when the kid hit him in the back of the head. That's impulsive too. So you got a lot of indications here of impulsivity. You are going to lose in fair hearing if you deny the request for assessment on this child. You've got too much going on with too many indications of impulsivity, typical of ADHD. Okay. Assessments. Yay. All right. Your assessment is definitely required before any special education services can begin. By the way, a school psychologist is the only one who can do a psychoeducational assessment. That does not mean you ignore outside assessments. Not at all. You cannot use a single procedure for the criteria. So what... And let's read the next one here. Use a variety of assessment tools and strategies and not any single measurement or assessment. So years ago, and you may still find a few districts that misinterpret this, but I tell you, throughout California, years ago, they took that last statement down there to mean that no single instrument could qualify a kid for special education, which is correct. But that they took it to the extreme so that the SAI teacher was not only having to give the Woodcock-Johnson academic test, but they also had to give another academic test, like the Wyatt, or maybe a shorter academic test. So that way they had two academic tests. The psychologist had to give two cognitives, two visual processings, two auditory processings. It was ridiculous, and it was a gross misinterpretation of this. What this law does, the intent, is to say that we could not use just the Woodcock cognitive and the Woodcock academics as qualification. All right. Basically, we're staying in the same, we've got this one big test, okay, and it's covering a lot of stuff, but it's produced by one company, which inherently takes one approach to assessment. They want a variety of assessments from a variety of companies, looking at the child from a variety of ways. So back when we did our discussion on psychoeducational reports, I talked about how I'll use supporting evidence from other assessments, and how we always have a primary assessment, and that's the assessment that has been normed for that particular area, for that particular processing area, and then we bring in supporting data for that. That's important. You always got to have your primary that's been normed. So if you're doing visual processing, you always do your VMIs. But then if you want to bring in supporting data from the Woodcock matrix or the CAS planning subtest, you can bring that in because that definitely incorporates visual processing skills. Okay. So you could not go out and just administer a CAS and say this kid qualifies for ID or not. And of course that's true for more than true for ID, because ID, you've got a low cognitive, you got a low adaptive, and you got a low academic. Okay, everything's below 70 or right there in that 70-ish area. Okay, assessments. So a local education agency must assess a special education student in all areas of suspected disability. We've talked about this before, that the word suspected, it means that we don't have to assess the child in all areas of disability. Now, the level of suspectivity, or when should we suspect a disability, is very low, very low. So you get one poor score, and you might want to look at that and say, hey, do I also need to assess for OHI? Do I also need to assess for ID or what have you? All assessments must be sufficiently comprehensive to identify the child's eligibility and the services that they need. That's your report. That's your psychoeducational report right there. It has to be comprehensive. It has to test in all areas of suspected disability. Now let me say one more thing about that. We typically assess for areas of ID, autism, OHI, SLD. Let's just use those four right now. And you're at a triannual, and the child qualifies under SLD, and you do an SLD assessment. That is, you do a cognitive, you got the academics, you do the visual processing, the auditory processing, the memory processing. But in your summary, you rule out, you state that the child is not eligible for special education under OHI, autism, ID. They do meet the eligibility criteria under specific learning disability. All right. Meeting the criteria under specific learning disability is good. Your tests have shown that. Your assessment shows that. You can even justify ruling out intellectual disability. You gave a cognitive. You ruled that out. And you've got some academic scores here. So I'm assuming you've ruled it out that way too. You did not do an autistic evaluation. But you said the child isn't eligible. That's a problem. Okay? Take the autistic and take the OHI out of your report if you did not directly assess for it. You cannot rule out an area, and your professional judgment isn't enough. You have to have assessed in that area in order to say the child is not eligible in that area. I think as school psychologists, we don't rely enough on our professional judgment, but this is an area where we're not allowed to. You know the child's not autistic, but you didn't assess for it, so you can't say that the child is not eligible. Okay. The assessment, this statement right here sort of reminds us that the only person who can do a psychoid assessment is the psychologist. So the screening of a student by a teacher or a specialist to determine appropriate instructional strategy shall not be an evaluation for eligibility. Okay, that's basically the part of the law that guarantees us a job. All right, tests and assessments must be used for the purpose for which they are valid and reliable, and administered by trained personnel. Okay, you're that trained personnel. Your speech and language pathologists are trained. Your occupational therapists are trained. The outside clinical psychologists, as well trained as they are, they're not trained for psychoeducational reports. And I have gotten in some beautiful reports from clinical psychologists, and they even utilize a lot of the same assessments we do. They'll use the CTOP, they'll use the cognitive tests that we do. Heck, someone will even use the academic testing. And really what they're writing is a psychoed that they can't call a psychoed. Now you can take that as a school psychologist, you can take that, look through it, and write a review of that clinical psychologist report that sort of supports the clinical psychologist's findings. I would also include in that report, that review, direct quote from the clinical report directly. Get a parent survey that you've done and incorporate it into that review. Get teacher input and incorporate it into that review. And of course, go over the educational history. Any indications of struggling in school throughout their education history, get their attendance, get their grades in there. You're basically doing a records review, incorporating that clinical psych's report. And that can be the psychoeducational report that you take to the IEP meeting. Basically, it's all based on the clinical psych report, but they can't do a psychoed, so you're reviewing it and authorizing it. Tests of emotional or intellectual functioning shall be administered by a credentialed school psychologist. That's you. That's in the Ed Code. No one else can do it as it pertains to a psychoeducational report or as it pertains to special education eligibility. So that goes back, that clinical psych, they do an intelligence test. You review the protocol. If you find it sufficient, you rule it sufficient, and you can use it. This does not mean that you have to ignore their findings. No. It just means that you must review the protocol and say that, hey, it was done right. Okay. Tests have to be validated for the specific purpose for what they were used. They're selected and administered so as to not be racially, culturally, or sexually discriminatory. and they have to be administered in the student's native language unless this is clearly not feasible. That's going to get us into some trouble, all right? Especially those of us in this area in Southern California who do not speak Spanish. I would imagine, in places like San Francisco, I understand they might have a higher Asian population. It could get us in trouble up there. You can use an interpreter to help administer these assessments. Just document the training you do with the interpreter. The interpreter must know that they are to say only what you say and repeat or translate for you only what the student says. They cannot help the student, and they cannot reword the statement without your permission. So you're reading from the Standardized Administration Guidebook, or they're reading and they translate it, and then they want to explain it a little bit more because the kid has this inquisitive look. And you and I, if we were sitting there and we spoke this language, we might use our professional judgment to explain the task a little bit. But they can't do that. They're not trained to do that. So they have to refer that to you. They have to say, I don't think he quite got it. Is there another way I can word this? It's hard because we don't speak the language. We don't know exactly how it was worded in the first place, but you just go with what you've done before. Okay? All right. So the totality of evidence, that is the work sample, the classroom, the test scores, the classroom observations, the surveys, the interviews, the education review, the current grades, all of that, in your psychoeducation report must produce a clear outcome. Your psychoeducation report is considered less valid if you do not reach a conclusion. That doesn't mean you have to qualify every kid, but it means that everything is supported toward a does not qualify statement and why the child is struggling. Or all of your evidence points to very clear dyslexia and ADHD, eligibility under SLD and OHI. But your report is consistent internally in that, and this will naturally happen if you're assessing the child correctly. And if you're assessing in all areas of suspected disability, you're going to rule out any sort of a how can I say it? Anything that might take you down a false path. So let's see. What's an example? You've got an SLD kid. In the past, they've qualified under SLD for attention processing. And we've talked about the difference between attention processing and attention deficit. And you're seeing more of an attention deficit. And you start giving some OHI assessments. And the Connors Continuous is pointing toward ADHD. The Connors surveys, the BASC, the classroom observations, everything is pointing toward ADHD. It's pointing away from SLD. And that will become clear as you're writing your report, and you'll just move the student's eligibility over to OHI because everything points in that direction. Okay, if you remember when we did the class on the visual presentation of the psychoed, that again is another way to show how all the evidence points in the same direction. And that's what you want in your psychoed. That's what will happen in a good psychoed. So after you get done with those assessments, it is your responsibility to produce a written report. In a lot of districts, what happens, and this is completely legal, what you see more and more of is the psychologist or the SAI teacher or somebody opening a Google Doc. And in that Google Doc, everybody goes in and puts their part of the assessment. So the SAI teacher writes up the academic testing. The speech and language pathologist comes over here and she puts in, or he puts in, their section. You're putting in your section. That's fine. I don't like it because it can't be formatted nicely and consistently. or if it can be, it's going to take a lot of work on the back end. So our reports, remember, some districts will call your report a psychoeducational report. Some districts will call it a multidisciplinary team report. You're not writing the report as much as you are assembling it. You're just gathering all this information from different sources. So you want to make sure there's a section in your report that talks about who all contributed to it, and that you're not the author. You're just the one bringing it all together. That being said, though, you must make the decision of eligibility, not qualification, but eligibility. Okay, because that's your job, and that report must be the basis of your decision. If you make an eligibility decision that's not backed up by the report, that's wrong, okay, and that's indefensible. If the IEP team decides to qualify a kid that you found to be ineligible, that's fine. That's legal. That's the IEP team's responsibility. So you're responsible for that report and only that report, and reaching a conclusion based on the information in it. All right, some limitations. So you can't qualify a child for special education if you can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they've not had accurate, appropriate reading and math instruction. Okay. And about the only way you can really prove that is if the child has lived in the mountains, they're 9 years old, the school's going to put them in 4th grade, and they've had no schooling at all. All right. Now that child wouldn't qualify for special ed necessarily. They're going to need a heck of a lot of tutoring, and it's going to take them years to catch up. But that's not a disability to have lived in the mountains and not gone to school. You can't qualify a kid just because they can't speak English and all the lessons are done in English. Again, that's not a disability. And of course, if they don't meet the eligibility criteria, they don't find them eligible. All right. Even if you know that in your district, there's really no other resources for them. They're not eligible for special ed. There's no resources. They're going to continue to struggle and possibly fail. But special ed is not a tutoring program. It's not a program to meet the general education requirement of providing an education to everybody. And it very often is misused that way. The other way special ed is misused is as a behavior intervention program, which is not. All right, you don't want conduct kids getting into special education ED classrooms. They will destroy the classroom. Okay. All right, what is FAPE? Here's your acronym that is very often misquoted. So it's a free, appropriate public education. When you write FAPE in your reports, you never write that the school district offered FAPE. It offers a FAPE. It offers a free, appropriate public education. I once, recently, last year, had a teacher explaining FAPE to the parent, free and public education. Free and public education. It's free, appropriate. Okay. We have offered FAPE when we have ensured that all students with disability, one, have access to a free education, okay, at about the same level as they're capable of doing compared to the general education peers. FAPE is offered when we protect the child's rights and the parent rights. A school district's offer of FAPE and special education is met when the student's IEP is individualized, basically. When the services on the IEP meet those services that the child needs, they meet those unique conditions that child is struggling under, and they have incorporated parent input. They are reasonably calculated to provide meaningful education benefit. Now, like we talked about, the ruling for did you meet FAPE used to always be the Rowley Act. But now we have the Supreme Court decision. So I actually changed the word meaningful there. I changed it. It was basic floor of opportunity. Or did it say some educational benefit? I forget. But anyway, meaningful is how the Rowley Act needs to be reinterpreted now. And that's meaningful under that child's unique circumstance. Okay, when do we reassess a student then? Anytime the parent requests a reassessment. You could end up reassessing a child every year. Now, typically, the law does allow us not to have to reassess a child within 1 year of our last assessment. So a parent cannot ask for a psychoeducational report every 6 months. But what they can do is have you do an assessment, 6 months later, ask for another assessment. You say no, ask for an independent assessment. Then the IEE person would come in, look at your assessment, administer different assessments. They're going to look at your psychoeducation report. They will administer different assessments so as to not get that practice effect, and they'll report to the parent. And then a year from that time, the parent has a right to ask for another assessment. The school must reassess if the parent asks for it and it's been more than a year. And the school must do this even if the school knows it does not need any more supporting evidence to qualify a kid to provide services to a kid. It doesn't matter. If it's been a year since the last assessment and the parent puts a request in, the school will reassess. That's what the law says. All right, reassessment waivers. Now, there is a waiver, and a lot of people don't know this. On your triennials, if you have a triennial, say it's a middle school, high school kid, they've been assessed a couple of times, and you feel absolutely comfortable that they continue to qualify. They demonstrate a need. That is, the SAI teacher can document that he or she is providing real benefit to this child, and that the child would really struggle without those services. You could ask the parent, hey, you know what? It's time for the triennial. I'd like to. The district says the child continues to qualify. I don't have to assess, if that's okay with you. And the parent has a right to say, yeah, sure, that's fine with me. Let's not pull him out for 3 or 4 testing sessions and miss all that classroom time. Simply to requalify. I would say about half the time I offer this to parents, and it's offered. There's a form letter that you fill out. I'll be glad to share it in a later presentation. If you want a copy of my form letter, I'll send it to you. Just send me an email. I would say about half the time I offer this to parents, they agree to it. They take me up on it. The other half of the time, they're like, no, we want to see what's going on. We want to see if they're making progress. We just want to know the psychoed. But that waiver option is there, and that's as of 2004. All right, the IEE, the Independent Educational Evaluation. It's going to be conducted by a qualified examiner who is not paid by the school district. They have no contact with the district, no conflict of interest. This person has only one interest, and that is the best interest of the student. This person is not worried about the district resources. They're not worried about the parent resources. They're not worried about the parent's anger with the district or the district's frustration with the parent. They're only worried about the child. And a good IEE stays focused on the child. To obtain an IEE, a parent must, and the law actually says the student, and you'll find this a lot in special educational law. It says the student must disagree with the assessment obtained by the district. What it really means here is the parent, and the parent is considered to be acting on behalf of the student when the student is under 18 years of age. But the law does say the student. So the parent, 1, must disagree, and 2, must request. Okay. What the parent does not have to explain why they disagree. In fact, you really can't even ask them. And even if you did, it wouldn't matter what answer they gave you, because the courts don't believe the parents are educational experts. They don't believe they are psychological experts. They don't believe that every parent out there should just understand every part of the psychoed and be able to tell you that, well, this standard score here is 3 points lower than this other standard score. And if you convert the T-score to a standard score for this test, you can see the conflict here between these two tests and the indications of no parent's going to do that, right? Unless they're school psychologists. So the parents do not have to say why they disagree. They simply have to disagree. And they have to request an IEE. Okay. It's going to be approved by almost every district. That being said, an IE is not automatically legally granted. All right. The school district has the right to file a due process, to request a hearing, to persuade the judge that their psychoeducational report is sufficient and appropriate. Now, when the district has the burden of proof, and that burden of proof rests entirely on your psychoeducational report, and you've written the best psychoeducational report ever, and the district's going to be able to defend your report, it's going to cost the district around $15,000 to $20,000 to get into the courtroom. That's mostly lawyer fees. The district's not going in there unprepared. The lawyers are going to have to review and take apart your psychoeducational report. It's not going to be pretty. But let's say it is. Let's say they say this is the best thing we've ever seen. Well, that's probably 6 hours worth of lawyer time right there, right? Let's do this. Let's take this battle on. So now the lawyers are going to come in and train your director, your teachers, and yourself. If the student's receiving counselor, the lawyer spends all this time training all these people how to answer questions in a courtroom, what to expect. And that's time. And all this time adds up. And so for a district to step into a courtroom, it's about $15,000. An IEE runs anywhere from $3,500 to $5,000. So financially, the district's better off just to grant the IE. So although it's not automatic, it pretty much is. Okay, it's not legally automatic, but in practice, all requests for an IE are approved. The district must also ensure that the independent educational assessment is provided totally at their expense. The parent pays nothing. Okay. So the parent can even ask for reimbursement of mileage and stuff like that from the district, should they choose to. Okay. One last piece of advice before we wrap this up is to please read those parent procedural safeguards at least once a year. And if you can read them 2 or 3 times a year, you'll be better off for it. Okay. They're given out at every meeting. Just ask for a copy. Go back to your office and read them. All right, so the information in here is not legal advice. I'm simply quoting and referencing legal laws. Guys, listen, you want something fun to do, get the IDEA, get the Code of Federal Regulations that apply to special ed, and read it. It is so exciting. If you want on that listserv for all the cases, all the fair hearing summaries, send me an email. I'll be glad to help you with that. All right, but this is definitely not legal advice. Let me bring this to an end, and we'll take questions. Let's see here. Let's do this, and we'll do this. All right. Welcome back, everybody. For those of you who are still awake, you can unmute. Let's have some discussion. Yes, ma'am.